They say we only use a fraction of our brain's true potential. Now, that's when we're awake. When we're asleep, our mind can do almost anything.
Such as?
Well, imagine you're designing a building, right? You consciously create each aspect. But sometimes it feels like it's almost creating itself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like I'm discovering it.
Genuine inspiration, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in a dream, our mind continuously does this. We create and perceive our world simultaneously, and our mind does this so well that we don't even know what's happening. That allows us to get right in the middle of that process.
How?
By taking over the creating part. Now, this is where I need you. You create the world of the dream. We bring the subject into that dream, and they fill it with their subconscious.
How could I ever acquire enough detail to make them think that it's reality?
Well, dreams, they feel real while we're in them, right? It's only when we wake up that we realize something was actually strange. Let me ask you a question. You never really remember the beginning of a dream, do you? You always wind up right in the middle of what's going on.
I guess, yeah.
So how did we end up here?
Well, we just came from the,
Think about it, Ariadne. How did you get here? Where are you right now?
And deeper we go. Deeper into that inner sanctum of gnosis and these outer rectums of reality. Deeper and down that cosmic rabbit hole with Alice, Sophia, Dorothy, and Inanna, in search of our dark sister and sister Christian like an Orphic night ranger. Deeper we go, where the falling angel meets the rising ape, to our own humanity. Deeper into the dream of the Red King and the collective unconscious. And this episode will deal with that concept and how to unleash the liberating forces of archetypes.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
That's coming, and you have arrived at Aeon by Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, I, your host Miguel, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. Why? Because you bloody deserve it. Because you're finally bloody waking up after being rickrolled to numbness by hating angels in so many incarnations. You know now you are the hero of 1,000 faces and one Facebook profile. And you're going to discover new heroic dimensions of yourself you never thought you had.
What is he doing?
He's beginning to believe.
With this, let me quote from the Gospel of Tommy, and please listen as you'll find it's very relevant to your sacred and profane quest and this week's topic. It goes, when you make the two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female. When you make eyes in the place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the kingdom. If they say to you, "Where have you come from?" say to them, "We have come from the light, from the place where the light came into being by itself, established itself, and appeared in their image."
People do it every day. They talk to themselves. They see themselves as they'd like to be. They don't have the courage you have to just run with it.
Yes, this has to do with the collective unconscious and archetypes. On show number 360, and on this late June, the year of our Demiurge 2017. And as mentioned, you'll gain the spiritual tech to access both. Why? Because that is your right as holders of the sacred flame of Hagia Sophia, who not only steal fire from the gods, but are creating better than the creator gods and their butt slaves in the establishment. What's more, you'll soon find that most occultists and scholars, even Carl Jung himself, missed the mark when it came to archetypes. They got it all wrong. To make this case and unleash your inner Prometheus, our astral guest is Steve Seven, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his book, The Idea of the Archetype, Ancient and Modern. It's a truly psycho-spiritual book of the highest order, and get ready to go deeper with these goddesses in our interview. For more information on Steve, please visit spiritualinstinctpress.com.
You know what crazy is? Crazy is majority rules. You can't handle the truth!
As you probably know by now, you'll get the first part of the interview here, while supporters get the full dope at our members section. Found at, you got it, thegodabovegod.com. Only $5.99 a month, where you also get a Pandora's box of more than 350 shows with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western Esoterica, and Free Thought, as well as the ability to join our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where Steve will be there to answer your questions. And I'm always there to answer your questions. And we have some mind-blowing discussions with such past guests as Tim Freak, Scott Smith, Sean Martin, Steve D, Andrew Phillips Smith, and many others. Damning your soul has never been this cheap, and neither has liberating your spirit. Joining also really helps keep this Red Pill cafeteria open, keeps the content coming, and new initiatives coming in the future. If this does not rock your Cosba, please consider supporting via Patreon, PayPal, or even snail mail. I can't do it without you. Much appreciation to you shining crazy diamonds who keep the lights of the pleroma on every week.
I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith.
And don't forget this important notion. Beyond the idea that you are an amazing creator, inventor, and designer, that you have the ability to write your own gospel and live your own myth. And that is that Philip K. Dick contended that our divine spark was actually our ability to have empathy. And unlike Ridley Scott, he didn't agree that androids could have empathy, since it was the one thing that couldn't be manufactured in the material realms. Empathy was divine, and empathy came from beyond. Sorry, Roy Batty.
I want more life, fucker.
Anywho, empathy or compassion, what makes us truly conscious is not really a concept, but a call to action. So help someone or make someone smile or make a life more interesting today, as we continue deeper into the collective unconscious for our true humanity.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
Like Jesus says in the Gospel of Tommy when asked how to know if there's divinity in a person, it's a movement and a meditation. In other words, it's heroic action and contemplation. And quoting further from the Gospel of Tommy, it says, "There is light within a person of light, and it shines on the whole world. If it does not shine, it is dark. Don't lie and don't do what you hate, because all things are disclosed before heaven. After all, there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, and there is nothing covered up that will remain undisclosed. And don't forget about love, my beloved truth seekers. And Steve 7 will be discussing some immersive insights on love as we go deeper into the collective unconscious and archetypes. Like the Gospel of Philip says, love never calls something its own. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is.
The spirit of the West. Excuse me, Mr. Spirit, sir?
Ah, there's a beaut. Sometimes you gotta dig deep to find what you're looking for. So you made it.
Is this heaven?
If it were, we'd be eating Pop-Tarts with Kim Novak.
Yeah, no kidding. What are you doing out here?
Searching, same as you.
I don't even know what I'm looking for anymore. I don't even know who I am. They used to call you the man with no name.
These days, they got a name for just about everything. Doesn't matter what they call you. It's the deeds make the man.
Yeah, but my deeds just made things worse. I'm a fraud. I'm a phony. My friends believed in me, but they need some kind of hero.
Then be a hero.
Oh, no. You don't understand. I'm not even supposed to be here.
That's right. You came a long way to find something that isn't out here. Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
So you made it. That's right, amigo. The other side of the road.
Did you just see that?
We each see what we need to see. Beautiful, isn't it?
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Steve 7 to discuss his book, The Idea of the Archetype, Ancient and Modern. How are you doing today, Steve?
Hi, Miguel. Thank you. I'm fine, and I'm very pleased to be here.
Wonderful. Glad you have joined us here at the Virtual Alexandria, and joining us, we've got the Moondog, the killer of ums and ahs himself, Vance. How are you doing today, Vance?
I'm doing amazing, Miguel. Amazing.
We'll see about that. But anyway, thanks for joining us, guys. And Steve, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to the esoteric side of life.
Well, to be honest, Miguel, I didn't know there was any other side. I came into this world, into a very hard life. I was, without wanting to go into too many details, I was subject to some very serious child abuse, some very violent, deliberate torture by my stepfather, who blamed his failed marriage on my appearance in his life as the illegitimate issue of my mother's, one of her adulterous affairs. And to cut a long story short, I was thrown into the invisible world as a natural and spontaneous healing process from my soul in reaction to this torture and abuse that I was subjected to as an infant. Even today, I remember 2 or 3 years old being able to sit on my bed at night and watch the walls of my room turn into a 3-dimensional holograph, which I thought every 2 or 3-year-old child was able to do that. But then, of course, I also thought every 2 or 3-year-old child had their stepfather or father sitting on them and pushing their face into the back of the sofa until they got carpet burns on their face, saying, "You're disgusting. No one's ever going to love you. You're ugly." And this was a natural constellation, if you like, a cathartic healing process that would relieve this inner tension from me each night. And so the invisible world, the so-called esoteric world, became a natural part of my life. Things like out-of-body experiences, even to the extent of conscious astral traveling and seeing visions, is something that I have had since as far back as I can remember, which is 2 years old.
Yeah, that's very intriguing, very poignant, and it's interesting you talking about that. I mean, we all have things that happen in childhood. In my childhood, I sort of retreated to comic books. Other things had some visions, experiences. Unfortunately, as I got older, I sort of self-medicated with drugs and alcohol and just bad behavior, if you would. Your story reminds me of my wife. She also had a hard childhood in the close to the same vein you had, but she also, her and her siblings would actually do the same thing. They'd be in the room, all this pressure, all this abuse, and they were able to astral travel, do telepathy, all that. It was a defense mechanism, but also a searching. So the question for you, Steve, is what do you think is the difference between somebody who takes my path and ends up lost in this world of drugs, alcohol, insanity, and somebody who continues perhaps optimizing these gifts that they get?
Okay, well, that's a good question, because in fact, I also, I've given you a little bit of insight into my very younger childhood days. By the time I was 12 or 13, I was quite a staunch atheist. And in fact, I also, throughout my teens, sought transcendence through drugs and concerts, rock music, and all of the rest. And I guess what really inspired me into the idea of the archetype as a form of communication with the invisible world was a experience that I had when I was 19, at the end of a very long period of drug abuse and, as I said, trying to find transcendence in more material, going to rock concerts and things like that. I had started noticing some transpersonal things like destiny or perhaps a guiding hand on my life. I mean, I'd written off 5 or 6 cars and, had been able to walk away from each one of them. And, I just started really questioning, is there something more? And I was synchronistically brought to some friends who were explaining to me about the spiritual dimension of life and that we are born with a divine soul. This was at age 19. And that was what Christians call a born again experience, if you like. In psychological terms, one could say that the archetype of the higher self for me was constellated. And I had a very powerful experience that lasted at that time, at age 19, for several weeks, maybe 2 months, where I felt every day as if I was lifted 12 feet above my body. This feeling, what Romain Rolland calls the Oceanic Feeling, that you feel like you are floating, and you feel overwhelmed by a sensation of love. Love is, if you were going to describe it in one word, it would be love. And again, this was a spontaneous, cathartic experience that brought a lot of healing to me at that point. It wasn't the complete package, if you like, but it started me off to understand fully, as an adult rather than just as a child, that there is something beyond the material realm, and I want to learn what it is. One thing that has really driven me is that at that point I knew that if I was wired up to an ECG machine, or came under some sort of clinical observation, that my biochemistry would be substantially altered. It was such a real experience that I knew that somehow science would be able to show this, to demonstrate this. We're going back 35 years, and science was really only just starting to do that then. But now science and neurology in particular have come a long way to understand how some of these experiences do actually change the neurons and our biochemistry. And so I always had this understanding that although philosophy was very important, there is also a level of scientific, rational understanding that can also explain these experiences. And the reason, of course, is because I wanted to understand them so that it is not just a fleeting period, but it is something that I can bring into my life as part of my everyday existence.
And how do you bring this to life? You obviously do a lot of psychoanalysis, you do a lot of psychotherapy, or at least you write about it in your book. What's unique or that the listener can learn about how to, again, reach their higher self?
Well, the first thing is the acceptance of it. And at 19, that was what happened, is that for me, just by bringing a new thought into your worldview, your neurons are firing differently. And if it's a dramatic new thought, when I'd gone from being literally brainwashed that I was worthless to all of a sudden accepting that I had a divine soul, then all of a sudden the synaptic energies, the function of the material structure of my brain changed so dramatically with the flow of the synaptic electricity, for want of a better word, that energy, that alone brought a large amount of disposable spirituality into my life, or usable spirituality, I should qualify it as. And so a lot of systems are based on self or auto-suggestive meditations, affirmations that we're giving. And these things have been proven for a long time that they work. They change the structure of your mind, and by doing that, they change the structure of your thinking. And that's the first step on a long process of actually rearranging your entire lifestyle so that you become autonomous. At the end of the day, the idea is to constellate your soul that you're born with, the authentic self that you're born with. And so for every decision you make, what job you're doing, what you're going to do, where you're going to live, having a garden, things like these sorts of things, so that you're actually in control of your own life. And step by step, all the people that I know who have had this communication from their soul, they start to rearrange their life so that they are autonomous, so that they are choosing their own life and it is not being chosen for them. You mentioned psychoanalysis. A lot of this dimension of choosing your own life is unpacking a lot of the programming that has been placed upon us, so that we know that when we're actually thinking something, it's a genuine thought from our authentic self and not something that has been programmed into us.
Well said. Yeah, the themes of the counterfeit spirit, the self, the higher self have been going around in our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis group, haven't they, Vance? What do you have to say to Steve?
Yeah, Steve, that's a wonderful story. I can relate to it. And yeah, indeed, in the Inner Sanctum of Gnosis, we're dealing with exactly that. One of our treasured members wrote a really nice piece on the authentic self and the nature of that. And I was wondering, Steve, had you had a beautiful, pampered existence where every problem was solved by your parents and so forth, do you think you would have crossed that line and become aware of your authentic self?
I often ask myself as a father, because now I'm 53, I was quite late having children. I was in my late 40s when we started. We've got 3 children. And I often ask myself, because of course, just like every other parent, I'm making my own mistakes again, and I'm learning more and more about my own childhood as I'm dealing with my children and learning better and better ways of being able to handle my children. And I think that in the end, it can't happen. I'll give you a really good example. We try and allow our children autonomy as much as we can, but full autonomy cannot be allowed because the child still needs to learn. And one battle that we had with our children was that they never wanted to wear clothes, and which is fine, when
I can relate. Yes.
I mean, this is a very innocent example, but it's actually quite widespread. It's a problem that I know a lot of parents have, to be able to teach their children, well, we're going out to the supermarket and you can't go naked. I'm sorry. I would love to be living in a world where you could, or here in Germany where we get, 10 or 20 below. Look, you can't go outside naked because it's too cold. And we had some battles. We did actually have some battles. And my partner and I, we were quite aware that as we were doing this, we were in some degree breaking the soul of our children. Do you understand? But the thing is that in the end, it's sort of like you have to in many ways. I mean, I know that in a lot of cases, the soul is really broken. Okay. But I mean, even just to acculturate your child to the world that we're living in is step by step is actually, to a greater or lesser extent is something that is breaking their natural soul. And it needs always, again, to be built up. At some point when they are in their late teens, probably, they will come to or during their teens, they will come to the point. And it is that period that when we've known, when our children are 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 years old, that we shouldn't have done that, or, it's been hard, but we had to do that. It's at the later period that we can make amends and say, yeah, well, look, I'm sorry. And I think as a parent who knows they're making mistakes, I think that to be able to say to your child, to have to be big enough to be able to say, look, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. That is what makes all the difference. For me to gain back my soul was a very long process, because there was always something against it. Whereas when you know that your child's soul has been broken simply because that's part of life, and I guess in a way a lot of the scriptures, a lot of the texts and philosophies accept that, and then accept that, okay, through self-awareness, later we can build it up. If you as a parent, or if one is a parent, and certainly my partner and I are very much aware of this, and we can apologize to our children now. And that is where it makes the difference, that you can actually help them, that you can actually guide them. But to go directly to your question, Vance, to be honest with you, I actually think that the level of experiences that I have had, not just as a child, but also as an adult, are directly concomitant to the amount of abuse that I was subjected to. And in fact, if you look at the literature of mysticism, both with the individual and in a collective, like a prophetic movement, you will see that one common denominator is that religious experience comes in the midst of oppression. When you look at the prophetic movements, in the early days of Christianity, I come from New Zealand, and there was a very powerful Maori prophet movement at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century. I know in Africa, it's similar to that, and I'm certain in America with the Native Americans, the original American Indians, and also with the black slaves. In the midst of oppression, it's the strongest movements of the spirit.
I would agree with you that. I think research has shown us that in times of great upheaval, there's a spiritual power that soaks the streets. Again, like you're talking about, it's that stress where we have to have a metanoia, as the Gnostics call it, the turning about to something greater. So you would say, and again, this is a debate we've been having, and hopefully you will join us when the show comes out, because we'd love your input, but you saying each of us has a higher self, a daemon before we are born or as soon as we're born, and it's all about aligning our lower self to this higher self. Is that how it is?
Yeah, that's exactly how it is. I mean, I agree with the Jewish mystic interpretation of the Genesis story, that there are two creation events, which for some scholars is a problem. In the scholarly world, usually they will try and say, well, this is a redaction. We have two separate tribes, if you like, when the 12 tribes were separated.
Right.
And one tribe wrote this event, this creation event, and another tribe, wrote this one. And then later they put them together, finger jointed them together. But us, brainy scholars can see it that, there's actually two separate events. Well, according to Philo of Alexandria, who was contemporary with Paul and Jesus, and a very influential rabbi and philosopher, that's deliberate. There are two creation events deliberately written. The first event is the invisible archetypes, okay, the first forms. And then the second event is the actual material universe. Okay, and when we see in the Hebrew, and particularly in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, where it says that we are made in the image of God, the actual word image is imago in the Greek, in the Septuagint, and which is the version that Philo was working with, and the word imago is archetype, and Philo actually draws directly into the Platonic forms to explain what that means, in so much as that the personal archetype that we have is from the beginning of creation. In other words, our soul, this personal archetype that was created at the beginning of time. So we have a soul that not only predates our physical body, but predates the physical creation, was created in the first creation event. And then as the creation becomes, in the process of becoming, then all of the archetypes, all of the first forms that were initially created become expressed in the physical world. And I mean, the idea of evolution is nothing new in that. The early rabbis and mystic Jewish commentators had always this idea that creation is becoming. And of course, Plato said, nothing is, everything is becoming, nothing is.
I'd like to maybe loop back when we start talking a little about the history of archetypes, and stick more or less to the main event right now. And, or you might say controversy, as you and I have talked about. And then we can loop back to the history and continue on the psychoanalysis. Let's get to it. Where, Steve, in your research, did Carl Jung go wrong in his idea of archetypes?
Carl Jung has become a sacred cow in psychology, depth psychology.
Yes, there's a lot of, Jung fundamentalists out there, and they'll let you know.
Yeah. So I should tread quite carefully. But in fact, it's. I think Jung found it very difficult to express himself. On the one side, Jung was always saying that the archetype is an unconscious image that cannot be apprehended consciously, and that's the way that I see it. But he was continually contradicting himself by saying that the archetype can be comprehended in the cross, the quaternity, Wotan. In fact, in the end, there becomes an infinite number. In the Jungian in analytical psychology, which is the Jungian school, so in the Jungian system, and also with his followers, there becomes an infinite number of archetypal forms. Now, the idea of the archetype is that the archetype is something that cannot be expressed. It cannot be apprehended. And what we are seeing is a symbol. like the cross, Wotan, the god forms, all of these things that people today are calling the archetype. I know that if Jung was sitting here right now, he would say in broken English, yeah, of course we can't apprehend the archetypes. And he actually wrote that occasionally. But by trying to express that these are archetypal symbols, somehow it became misinterpreted, even perhaps by himself in some way, but certainly by his followers and those that have picked up the baton of the archetype through the way that it has been expanded by Jung. And this is not just a pedantic nuance, because it's very important to understand that the personal, Jung's famous for, bringing coining the term, the collective unconscious, which I have, that is a very apt phrase, that we're all born with a bedrock, a psychic bedrock that is common to all people. And these archetypes are contained within the collective unconscious. But all of these different symbols that are sometimes quite culturally specific are something a little bit different. They are pointing to the archetype, but they aren't actually the archetype. Another level that connects here, where Jung sort of changed his mind, initially he described the archetypes as the images of instincts. And then he qualified that by saying, so the theory of the collective unconscious is no more daring than saying that we have instincts. Later, after that, this was in 1934 when he wrote the book, volume 9, part 1, the archetypes and the collective unconscious. After the war, he qualified that, and he was probably influenced by the war. And he said, the archetypes are the polar opposite of the instincts. They are the counterbalance for the instincts, as you can see when you see someone who is controlled by their animal nature, compared to someone who is following a spiritual direction. Now, this is really where I think the Jungian system falls down, and not just the Jungian system, but psychology in general at this point, and a lot of evolutionary biology as well at this point, affected by a lot of the very aggressive negative events like the 2 world wars. We're saying that we have our natural instincts are aggression. Our natural instincts are, if you like, evil or something like this, where, this animal nature. And in fact, in psychology all the way through, the only voice that did not agree with that initially were the humanists, Maslow, who said, well, actually, if you look at the animals that are closest to us, the primates, they are not aggressive. They are, in fact, quite altruistic in their natural behavior. And now, in the last 10 or 20 years, developmental psychology and neurology is putting a very big question mark over this idea of whether we are naturally aggressive, or whether, as the clinical evidence suggests, is that aggression is learned. In other words, for me, and I guess like my press firm is called Spiritual Instinct Press, because for me, in fact, the archetypes, I go back to what Jung first said, the archetypes are our instincts. And we don't have, as Jung came to believe, as most psychologists in the middle of the 20th century did believe, we don't have instincts towards aggression. These behavioral syndromes that we end up being, that become quite universal, I admit, they are they are not a natural part. They're not part of our natural makeup, but they are what happens in the situations that we end up in.
Well said. And do you have a question, Vance, or do you need to consult your Santmont masters first?
Oh, no, they've already pre-canned all the questions. You know, they told me what to say. Inside joke, Steve. Isn't it a matter of, and I'll just ask your opinion, although you can hear I already have one, of the structure of archetypes? And, it seems to me that we all talk about archetypes as a big pile, a big bucket of archetypes. But I've noticed there's a definite structure that one archetype can be built out of more primitive ones. But in particular, I wanted to ask you, and this is related, the laws of the physical universe. Do you see the underlying laws of the universe as archetypes in themselves? Because they do share a lot of the characteristics that you've named so far.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point. And in fact, in my book, I talk about Freud, who also wrote about the archetypes. Initially, Jung used the word imago. And in 1911, when Jung and Freud were still cooperating, Freud referenced Jung's first use of this imago, which became archetype later, but it was the same principle, the same concept. And he talked about it in the sense of the father archetype. Freud was borrowing, like referencing and borrowing the word imago as archetype and referenced Jung and was talking about the father archetype. It was in the context of transference, which is a phenomenon that's experienced by psychologists when, the archetype of the father for the client is projected onto the therapist. And the reason that I mentioned Freud is because, like Freud, I see two levels of archetypes. I see the archetypes as what we have personally as instincts, which are also in the collective unconscious, and we can talk about that in a minute, would be quite interesting. But there are also forms that, exactly as you say, are part of the principles of the universe. And I see things like, for example, just love is an archetype, okay? And in fact, the eros in Freud is not lust or sexuality. The eros is specifically referenced by Freud as coming directly from Plato's Symposium. In other words, because Freud just says, I'm using this word, in this case, eros, and I am using it exactly as Plato did in Symposium. That's it. He's going to let you go and read Symposium, and then you understand what he means, what Freud means by eros. And of course, most people, including the psychoanalysts who are reading Freud, don't bother doing that. It's been badly translated into English. The whole Freudian collected works has been, it's well known, it's badly translated into English. And so all of a sudden, psychoanalysis is picking up eros meaning sexuality. It's not. It's actually meaning love as a daemon, as an intermediary between people and the gods, exactly as it is in Symposium. And that is what Freud means. So this is, Van said, specifically for your question, is that there are bigger dynamics to the archetypes. Another dynamic, when you say about the laws of nature, I think pretty much anyone that's got a serious rational understanding of spirituality is not saying anything against evolution. I've already mentioned that the mystic strand in Judaism saw always evolution and becoming. And in fact, for me, the primal archetype that we as people have, or even I would say all animals, and in fact perhaps all forms of life, is the archetype for personal development. For me, that's the center archetype. That's all other archetypes are based on that. Okay. You could say that the larger ones like truth, justice, love are the fuel. And then the steering wheel is personal evolution. So yeah, in answer to your question, absolutely. There are the dynamics, the laws of nature are definitely archetypal. I mean, people talk about karma. Well, karma, if you like, can be seen as the archetype of truth and justice. And in fact, when you understand karma a bit deeper than, the popularist understanding of, cause and effect and things like that, there's a lot more to it in the Sanskrit system than just that. And you can see that there is integral in this concept and its broader context, that this is like an archetype. It's like gravity. I'm not saying actually that gravity itself is an archetype, but it's a principle of the way that the universe operates. And I think that Plato also saw it like that with the example of Eros.
Well said. And I think on an interesting note, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was talking about Twin Peaks, and the guest was saying, it was talking about Dr. Jacoby, and he said, well, Dr. Jacoby, he's part of the archetype of Terence McKenna. And I was like, no, neither one of them are archetypes. They're part of a deeper archetype, the shaman and so forth. But actually, there's a difference between the archetype and the archetypal symbols, right, Steve?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. I mean, the archetype is something beyond our conscious comprehension. There are many symbols. I mean, Jung himself actually admitted straight out that he had no real evidence. His best evidence that these actual images were defaulted, if you like, in our brains or in the collective unconscious was this example of the sun with the phallic. That one of his patients had a dream that the sun had a phallic blowing air over the earth, and that was a very similar, if not directly related to an old alchemical symbol that was used in the 16th century or something like that. That was it. That was his primary example or evidence that these actual symbols were defaulted in the collective unconscious. But when you start looking, and Jung's works are full of different examples, each one has a slight variation to the other. And that's how you end up with a situation, well, we've got an infinite number of images defaulted in our mind. But in fact, we don't have the actual image defaulted in our mind. We have a drive, an instinct, if you like. And then as we are apprehending the world that we're living in with all of the specific cultural ideas and images that we're surrounded with, then the image is formed to us, for us, so that we can grasp it. All of the different myths are full of these symbols that are pointing to the archetype, but the symbol itself is not the archetype. So, you don't have the wise old man. It's not an archetype. The wise old man is a symbol that is pointing to your higher self and helping you to reach your higher self. And it can work with other symbols in a complex, but they're not the archetype, and as our societies and cultures evolve, the symbols also evolve.
Isn't it like the map and the territory? I mean, I used to love to listen to Alan Watts, and he was always talking about not confusing the map and the territory.
I think that's a perfect analogy.
I would say so too, and it makes perfect sense. So tell us, Steve, as you mentioned, you wanted to talk about the collective unconscious, which is also a very sexy term in the occult. Yeah,
I mean, the collective unconscious is a term that Jung coined. Freud agreed with it. In fact, he was disparaging of it only in as much as it goes without saying. He said, I don't think in Moses and Monotheism in 1939, Freud ended up saying it probably must have been annoying him for a long time that Jung was better at coining words than he was. And I think that's how Jung ended up.
It's all marketing, yes.
That's how, exactly. That's how Jung ended up being able to market a little bit better, was that Jung was better at coining these words. And the last book that Freud wrote in 1939, Moses and Monotheism, was released in 1939. He said, I don't think we gain anything by the term collective unconscious. The unconscious is collective. It's a collective property, universal property of mankind in any case. In other words, so what? We all knew that anyway. And in fact, the bones, or the skeleton, if you like, of both the collective unconscious and the archetypes, Freud had laid that out in 1900 in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, which was the book that started him off with psychoanalysis as a practitioner. And in fact, the Oedipus complex is in fact what Jung later said, well, there's an archetype. And Freud had already long since been saying, well, we've got this defaulted in our mind. I actually don't necessarily agree with Freud, and certainly not in the literal sense, although in my book I actually write a little bit about the way that that Freud changed his mind over sexuality. And in fact, it's probably better to read it from Freud as a metaphor rather than a literal sexual thing. And again, it comes back to this metaphor or a metaphor for autonomy. In other words, killing Laos, the father, is a metaphor for a person gaining autonomy from their parents. And the whole kind of incestuous thing with Jocasta is a metaphor for the unhealthy codependence that many people end up with their families, where they want their autonomy on one side, but they also want all the benefits of having parents who, worked for 20 or 30 years longer and have saved up lots of money and can sort of bail them out if they get into trouble. And this is actually a thread that runs through a lot of psychology as well. This whole idea, again, back to this autonomy and, what position do the parents place, or what place should they be playing in our life, as we get older, and we are trying to gain more and more autonomy. And in fact, we can see this also in a lot of fairy tales, most particularly things like Hansel and Gretel, or Little Red Riding Hood, where a good fairy tale is a fairy tale where the parents who are reading to their children also get a little bit of knowledge and wisdom. And when we look at Hansel and Gretel, this witch with her house that traps the children because she's giving them the sweets. And then, as the parents reading this to their children, they're thinking, it's a bit like your grandparents, isn't it? They're always giving us sweets, but there's always something, they always want us to do something for them, or even if it's just, what I mean? It's like they're trying to buy us with their sweets, And so there's these different levels that are coming all the way through. And again, these aren't archetypes, like Little Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel or the witch with the house. These aren't archetypes. These are symbols that are helping us reach our higher self, which is always working towards autonomy.
Agreed. And Vance, before we start getting into a little bit of history, do you have any questions about collective unconscious for Steve?
Well, I asked my collective unconscious, and it says not at this time, but I do.
That ignorant, no gnosis collective unconscious, huh?
Yes, but could it be said, Steve, that let's say take the Hansel and Gretel and the sweets, isn't behind all those kinds of stories a real archetype of the trap? In other words, I can think of analogies in physical laws where there are certain scenarios, like an arrow. There are certain non-reversible processes that seem to be constructed upon earlier physical laws, where once the process happens, it can't happen. And in fact, isn't time the ultimate non-reversible trap pattern where you can't go back?
Are you saying that the trap is an archetype? The whole idea of being in a trap is an archetype?
Yes, generally. There's an archetypical trap structure in the world of archetypes that we can't see directly, but that manifests itself in things like people getting married because of certain bad reasons, and then because of having to keep their word, they're trapped. Or, I mean, any number. The mouse trap being a more specific one. There's something tasty, the sweet, the cheese in the case of the mouse. And it's an irreversible process because once the mouse is attracted to the bait, then the trap is activated and the mouse is killed or, fatally injured. I think there's an archetype in back of all those situations if you factor it out. And I'm not saying that the mouse trap is an archetype or that Hansel and Gretel is an archetype, but I think those are symbols. And sometimes I see symbols as, and I don't mean to soliloquy here, but sometimes I see symbols as even my perception of the physical world is really just a perception of symbols, that symbols point to the archetypes which are unseen.
Okay, I understand now fully what you mean, and I'm glad you asked that, because I've actually done a lot of battling in my own head about this sort of the negative archetype, if you like, the shadow as an archetype, because for me, most of this is a little bit tangential, but I have to qualify by saying that most shadow symbols are personal complexes. They become symbolized and quite universally sometimes, or quite broadly, but they have come from a personal situation, a personal complex. But I have got to the understanding that there is a collective archetype that is our shadow. In other words, that we're born with, defaulted in our head, an archetype which can be symbolized in the trap very easily, and it's fear. Okay? Now, again, the archetypes are instincts. For me, love is an instinct. Being attracted to our parents, psychologically and emotionally, is an instinct. So the idea that we have a father archetype and a mother archetype works very well. And there are a lot of symbols that come off that. The idea that we have fear is something that is not universally accepted yet in psychology. But one thing that is very clear in developmental psychology is that, and something that I have witnessed personally with my own children very graphically, is that a baby is born with the ability to categorize their caregivers. And that's, on the one hand, evidence of the mother archetype and of the father archetype, because you can see in a baby that is being breastfed that the mother has a special psychic attraction. And the father, in my case, when, like I'm the father, and I am the second, I am number 2. And then her siblings are number 3 on that level of categorization. Hand in hand with that, the baby is also born with an ability to differentiate a stranger. And that manifests in what is best described as much as a baby can understand it, fear, stress. And that is a natural instinct. Now, that fear is something that can be deliberately manipulated by society in xenophobia, and that's how, many cultures create wars by by saying those people over there, and it's very easily taken up by the culture that, oh, yeah, that's right, they are bad, those people over there. It's very, very easy to mobilize one group against a different group. And this fear can start to manifest in many, many ways. Like, I'm not talking necessarily, and I don't know the answer to this. Psychology doesn't know the answer as to whether we have a fear of spiders. It's possible that we have inherited, that the collective unconscious of humans has somehow inherited through the experience of, past generations. I have personally seen some evidence in my oldest daughter that she was born with a fear of the dark, and it was quite graphic with her. And yet my son, who's 3 years younger, did not show me such behavior. So again, but one thing is very clear, that is also very clear in the clinical experiments or the clinical observations, and has been very clear in my own observations of my own children, is that we are born to differentiate a stranger, which is, quite logical that would be the case, that we would have an instinct to differentiate a stranger. And it manifests in stress and fear. And from that, and there could be others, but from at least that one, we can start unpacking an archetype of a shadow archetype. And specifically talking about your trap, the biggest trap, and Erich Fromm made a literary genre out of this concept, this principle. One of the reasons that so many people are quite happy marching to the tune of their culture as opposed to finding their own tune and constellating their authentic self is that they have a fear of being alone. And that's probably the most important skill, if you like, or worldview of someone who wants to take on the journey to find their authentic self, is that you cannot have a fear of being on your own. And that's the trap.
Oh my God, that's so amazing.
Makes sense, yes. And I did say we should move into a little bit of history, but this is really fascinating, Steve. So you mentioned shadow. You're talking about the archetype of fear. What about Jung's idea of shadow, that we're simply projecting different, different energies upwards and outwards, and we project our shadows on others?
Of course, I mean, one of the most common things with the ego is that it will not say change. The ego is very conservative. The ego does not want to be challenged. And so if there is something that your soul is trying to put on you as something that you need to change, something that fails in your life, then it is a natural mechanism of the ego to project it out. And one of the ways that we can find our own personal shadow, most of these projections are extrapolated into a personal situation, and so they are more, rather than an archetypal shadow, they are what I would call a personal shadow, whatever fault it happens to be in the individual. And the ego will naturally project it out. So as Jung says, I mean, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, a great deal of what Jung has written is very astute psychology. When we see something wrong in someone else, the very first thing that we must ask is this just a projection? Do I not want to see that in myself? Is that something of me that I am seeing in that other person? I don't hold, as many people do, that is 100%. I think there is still a level of discernment. Once we've come to the point when we say, well, is that me? And we're really honest with ourselves, then there are situations where you might see someone who's a thief or, a child abuser or something like that, or, in a bigger sense, you might see that, well, this dictator here is actually not helping the culture. And to make a critique like that is not always going to be a projection. And again, a lot of people, they're taking one thing that Jung has written and saying, well, that's just broad brush. Every time that you think that person is like you make a criticism of, I don't know, that dictator over there, that's something from inside yourself. I think that's the starting point, that you must ask yourself that. But there is still, and I'm saying this because I know I'm going a little bit further than the question, but that's an important part, is that discernment is a very integral part of the walk, so that we are able to know ourselves. And by knowing ourselves, the more that we know ourselves, the more that we are able to know those in our life.
I think that's all the time we have today. Vance, thanks for joining us today and bringing your higher masters, the Jesuits, and the collective unconscious to the interview.
Oh, we've got a whole collection of characters. They're all archetypes.
Yes, we're all fragmented and we all got our symbols. But and thank you very much, Steve. Thanks for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your very compelling, very intriguing, and I enjoyed this book very much. Thanks for discussing the idea of the archetype, ancient and modern.
Thanks, Miguel, and Vance also. Thank you both very much.
And there you have it, Steve Seven on an immersive treatise on archetypes and the collective unconscious, and mucho más. It gets even better though, oh you modern day Tom Sawyers. We go deeper in our second part, fully delving into the historical evolution and discovery of archetypes and how they were leveraged in Christianity and Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. Of course, touching upon the misunderstood but vital idea of the logos, looping back to more Jung and Freud and other exemplars of psychology. We understand how cultures clothe archetypes and what's behind them. Perhaps best of all, Steve gives us the full dope on how to make these archetypes work for us in our existences down here in the Canoma. And much more. Thanks for the company, Vance, and I should thank our webmaster Luthien for keeping the site purring like Bast. Only $5.99 to join for the entire interview, and Patreon supporters also get access. It really helps keep this Red Pill cafeteria open and content coming. I can't do it without you. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, but you are mine too in so many ways. Thanks for materializing at the virtual Alexandria, and let us continue journeying into the collective unconscious to find out who we really are. Hello and goodbye as always.